So welcome everyone to our webinar, which is organized by the Aryan Policy Organization or institution. So our first speaker is Dr. Kall Loper. I think she's going to present for like 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we have 10 minutes question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please put the questions in the chat while Dr. Kall Loper is presenting, and then I can direct the questions to him. Or if you could wait after that, after he finishes the presentation, of course, you can ask the questions yourself. So with that, I pass things to you, Dr. Loper.
All right, thank you. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you to the Aryan Policy Institute for hosting this today. It's I can't actually see you all here, but it's good to know that you're there. Just a quick introduction, and I do mean very quick. Right now, my role is leading digital forensics and incident response at a company called cybersecurity, which has recently merged from Fishtech and Herjavec groups. It is a fairly substantial player in the pure play security market. We're quite proud of our position in the market. But that's not really what I wanted to get into. Part of my offering includes the Threat Analysis Center, which is really about contextualizing cyber threats and making it meaningful, taking it from the technical into the business leaders who depend on it. And I think there's an application there for academia too. I just did a different conference yesterday where it seemed to be fairly well received. In my spare time, I'm a professor of computer science, although my initial degree is in the social sciences, but more like data science. It was just so long ago, we didn't really call it that. And over the last 25 years, I've worked in, as a professor of computer science, of course, and then throughout my career in digital forensics and incident response, I've done numerous incident response in the field. Some of the largest ones that have made headlines that I can't specifically mention. I also led a 4-state forensic collection, and the largest forensic collection to date, and that was part of the Deepwater Horizon event. And that was an administrative nightmare, more so than a technical exercise. But just help you understand a little bit about where my perspective comes from and what I'm trying to bring to this. I wanted to share with you a model that I use with my teams, and this is part of that narrowing in on the concept of identity in modern network investigations. When I deploy an investigation team or an incident response team to the field, we use this perspective to guide our activities. We secure identity, and I'll spend the rest of the presentation talking about that, but also in that context, we examine endpoints and we examine network telemetry and other witness systems that exist on the network. And the idea is all of those come together to provide a picture, but identity is the non-standard one. We're used to dealing with technical domains of network and endpoint, but modern incident response also is driven by identity. And let me explain what I mean by that. To understand identity, you should understand what it does, why we use it. I'm sure everybody's logged into a computer, and if you're in this conversation, you've done that successfully, so well done. Part of establishing your identity online is to authenticate, right? We want to match the user with their online identity so that someone else can't subvert it or use it, so that that user has a consistent identity when they get online. And that's just handy. We also use identity to authorize people to go into certain areas or access certain resources. So the auth N and the auth Z are often used because those two words sound so very similar. But auth Z is what you are permitted to do online by virtue of your identity. That implies an entitlement, and an entitlement is a specific and granular ability to access data or a process. So you might be able to access a website, or you might be able to access data contained in a database because your identity has been entitled to get to that point. This brings in some other questions that we'll be developing later, but the whole idea of a groundwork is to do that. Finally, we define roles, and these are handy because some organizations have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of members. Even a fairly robust university will have upwards of 60,000 people there, as many as 80,000 or more affiliates across university systems, can go into the hundreds. So we give roles, for example, a student role or a faculty role or a network administrator role, and these come with collections of entitlements. Again, granular accesses to certain systems that are gathered up conveniently into that role. Now, understanding that this is how we organize ourselves online, we start flowing into some of the implications of that. And one of them is how we structure identity, how we implement it. Some of you may be familiar with this already. Microsoft has a system called Active Directory. It is by far the most dominant means of establishing identity in enterprise systems. So all the large corporations out there, most universities. I will also mention that it's possible to do something like this in Unix. Certainly it's available, although many Unix systems do authenticate onto an Active Directory system. This is a way that your identities are tracked. That's what we mean by the Active Directory, and it's housed in a server called a domain controller. But you also have local authentication. So if you own your own laptop, you might log in locally with a password, and you might even have an administrator password that has more power. And if you're using an administrator identity to do your day-to-day work, stop that. If you want to make yourself much, much safer from ransomware attacks or any other, kind of foolishness out there, just use a user identity. We'll talk about that as a form of architecture. But there are numerous methods out there. And what I'm really trying to get at is identity is not just a nebulous concept. It is an extremely precise application of permissions, entitlements, and systems that implement it. And to think of it in a more abstract sense would really be to miss a fundamental understanding of how we interact with it and what we do with it. So I thought we might have a little bit of fun and go through a basic hack. This is something that we find is an extremely common feature when there's an intruder in a system, and that is the way most ransomware attacks start. So it can be as simple as just entering a few commands. Today, hackers are wary of our automated tools, particularly the endpoint detection and response tool. If you remember network endpoint identity, the endpoint has software on it that can monitor what's going on in the computer and stop illicit programs. So the attacker has learned to exploit identity. And what they will do is come in and get a privileged identity, something with administrator power, or if you're a Unix person, the root access. And with that power, they can then implement commands that administrators would. Now, this is an incredibly powerful implication when you think about it, because the attacker is capturing an identity that is privileged or entitled to do anything on the system. That attacker can effectively bypass security because they are acting as an administrator. So the computer doesn't understand the difference between your identity as a system administrator employed by, say, the university, and an attacker who is exploiting your identity. Right? And this is the basis of the live off the land attack. So in this particular attack, the system, the endpoint, protects its most valuable resource, which is the database that is the Active Directory that contains all identity information, and every computer on the system by name. Anything that's entitled to be on that system is tracked in that Active Directory. And the attacker wants to take that so that they can crack it and exploit identities that are also present in there. It's an incredibly valuable part of the attack to them. But you can't access that database when the system is running. So what an administrator has to do to back that up or do other administrative tasks with it is create a shadow copy. They essentially create a copy of it in a space that's not protected. And this is how they go about doing it. They use a service called VSS admin. And you can't simply lock that down. You can restrict it so that only administrators can use it, and that's normal. But if the attacker has that administrator identity, they have the full power to use that role and all of its entitlements. The next thing they do is create a list of all the volume shadows that are there so they can actually go back into the history of the machine and see what other shadow copies are present. And doing that, they can output the entire contents of that directory in a simple command. This is telling them what specifically to take while they're there. And in their next step, they just copy 3 key files out. And the reason they do that is because acting as an administrator doesn't trigger most security tools. It can be set to monitor this, but that means that there's going to be a false alarm every time an administrator performs a relatively innocuous function. So we have to balance false positives versus, absolute security. If an attacker was to download a tool, there are any number of them. Mimikatz is fairly well known. If you haven't heard of it, it's just a powerful hacking tool that will let you go in and extract identities from these protected files. If they ran that on the system, the endpoint would immediately stop it. The network layer and all the witness systems there and the high-end security tools that we buy would identify the activity and stop it. But because this is an exploited identity, the attacker is able to export these files and then slowly exfiltrate them out of the network. In fact, we did a response with a global engineering firm, think 90,000 plus people. And the trigger for that whole alert, and this started on a Friday afternoon and continued through till about 4:30 the next morning. And we had the CIO of a global enterprise like that on the phone until 4:30 in the morning. It was that serious. Somebody had come in and tried to exfiltrate the key file that held all of the secrets of that directory. And there came a point where we had to consider doing something that would conceivably take that business out of production for large and unpredictable areas for weeks, if not months. So the cost of an incident can be part of the recovery that's necessary to prevent it again. If the attacker had gotten away with this file, they would have had to reset all of their identity secrets. And that is just extremely disruptive. It would have cost them, in terms of contractual defaults, in terms of the labor that goes into it, idled workers. It is an incredibly non-trivial event to try and do that. As it turns out, because we work multiple work streams at the same time, while we were coaching them through the containment phase, the investigation teams were pouring through the logs and were able to find that only a small portion of that file had been exfiltrated before the automated defenses kicked in and stopped it. So because the attacker was slightly sloppy, they blocked that attack. But right up until that point, we were within probably 15 minutes of pulling the trigger and shutting down their entire enterprise identity system. And that was an incredibly close call. Fortunately, we explained it well, and they understood that we hadn't just brought them to the brink of disaster for no reason. We explained the risks. That's why it took so long. But that was a very good outcome, and showed the value of actually doing investigation instead of just doing security remediations. But I digress a little bit. This is perhaps the place where it would open up into broader concepts. I wanted to lay down some of the basics so we could talk about these. And this is the last slide, but it's probably the most packed with information. We use a security model. This is the cybersecurity model. It was created by my team, and it's different than some in the market, but it's not unheard of. It's not unprecedented. We like to use the Threat Assessment Center to help our clients anticipate. And that's really what we've done here. We've added the anticipate to it. And that is a deeper contextualized understanding that allows you to prevent and effectively respond and ultimately recover. But there are some concepts that go here. We've talked about attackers living off the land. And if you know that these types of attacks are by far the most common now, the vast majority of successful intrusions will exploit live off the land techniques where they use the tools that are already on the system, or in some cases download tools that have legitimate purposes and aren't necessarily blocked by the security technologies. That is something you can anticipate and try and get in front of. And one of the implications of this is a huge shift toward protecting identity rather than just protecting endpoints and just protecting network. And until, I don't know, as late as the last 5 to 8 years, identity has largely gone, it's been the little brother of the other two. There are tools out there that help large organizations govern identities. How do they manage those entitlements? How do they collect the roles and then check the roles to make sure the roles are still legitimate? This is in large part a business function. What entitlements do a group of users need? Say the accounting team may need access to finance, they may need access to the accounting tools and storage, whereas other groups, say sales, wouldn't need those kind of accesses. So that's helpful, and it flows into identity management. Some of you may have used single sign-on devices, Okta, right, where you sign on once and it authenticates you into other systems, right? So that authent function. Something you may or may not interact with on a regular basis is privileged ID management, or PAM. Or PAM, depends on the type of tool you're talking about, but privileged access management, privileged ID management. There are tools out there that will take an identity and either give it an entitlement on the fly, so it authenticates within its own closed system to say, this is a person who should have admin privileges, but that admin identity doesn't have those privileges until it needs them, and only just then. What this helps prevent is if an identity is cached out on a remote system, right? One of the things the attackers love to do is harvest those remote systems that they have access to. And if they can capture a system where an administrator has logged onto that, they can then get that privileged ID that they need to implement their attack. So if your compromise starts with an email, they'll get onto the user system and they can get system privileges very quickly. So local administrator. But if a domain administrator or somebody from the IT team has logged into that machine to do maintenance, they then have access to that cached identity, which might still have a valid token associated with it, might still any number of ways they can exploit that, might have their password cached there, which can be broken. So privileged ID management can be an incredibly powerful tool. I used to run the SOC for a Fortune 500 company at Security Operations Center, and we used a privileged ID management, and my admins and my security people would have to log in to that system and then take that day's password. The benefit to that method is those passwords changed regularly, so they were only good for a day. And then that system went out to all the other systems and managed their passwords, and it produced extremely long, unintelligible passwords, so that you had to use the PAM system to take that password and then basically paste it into wherever you were trying to log in. It was a little bit primitive by modern standards, but it was vastly more secure than what they had been doing previously. Identity architecture is another good way to go about this. That architecture can be used to restrict certain identities to certain domains of activity. And without getting into too much of the nuts and bolts, if you imagine there are things that you only need to do to manage the network, that would be a network administrator or a domain administrator. That is kept entirely separate from the administrator who runs servers. And not all organizations make that distinction, but it is part of the Microsoft 3-tiered architecture that they recommend to keep you safer in the event of a compromise. Because a domain administrator wouldn't need to log in to perform maintenance on a server. So if the attacker got access to that server, they wouldn't have domain entitlements. They wouldn't be able to go anywhere in the network and basically do anything. And even if they did, they couldn't log on to servers because that's a separate tier of administrator privileges under that architecture. My goal here is not to teach any particular way about this, but really to give a more nuanced understanding of identity and what that means for security and what that means for predicting attacker activity and seeing where they're going to target. If you get to the respond function, identity and lateral movement, that's really what we've been talking about the whole time. If you have a domain admin credential, if there's not sufficient architecture in place, you can then move laterally, which is one of the phases of an attack that lets them get to other server, access other resources. Any number of just malicious effects can occur with that. The idea of an identity reset, that's what I was talking about with that last most dramatic move. Kind of the nuclear option in security is to do a complete identity reset. And that has to do with the mechanisms by which identity is implemented. You reset all the cryptographic secrets on a network so that there is literally only one person sitting at a console right now that has access to that entire enterprise's systems. And then you start building out secure rings beyond that by changing passwords, making sure they're strong, being really careful about how those identities are entitled, and then moving out and securing as you go. That's the identity reset. And a complete domain recovery is potentially where you take it back to a safe state, or following an identity reset, you do a domain recovery. And this is just finding ways to bring back damaged systems from backups. In this case, we're focusing on identity, but the idea there is really to take you back to a safe state. Now, pulling this all together, and I've gone over my time just a touch, but pulling it all together, understanding the role of identity, that it is separate from what we often conceive of identity, kind of the social sciences, but understanding also that it's a really powerful tool to understand what the attacker is doing and to trace the attacker from place to place within the network. It also has some real implications for insider threat. So if you're going to investigate an attack, one of the questions I always get is, was this an insider? And if the first thing you tell them is, well, this identity was used, naturally, the first thing they want to do is call the police and have the person who owns that identity arrested. But a more sophisticated understanding, and what we do very quickly is talk them out of that. Say there's no guarantee that this person just logged in with their own normal password and their own normal identity, right? It's much more likely that an intruder accessed that identity, and then we investigate that until we find that the set of facts that support that theory. So there's a lot to do with it. Understand the nuanced discussion of identity, and this goes back many, many years. You know, everybody knows online identities are a little bit malleable and flexible, but the way they're implemented makes them possible to investigate. You just need the right access to the systems. And with that, I will take a breath and end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loper, for the very interesting topic. So any questions that folks you might have for Dr. Loper? I found the topic really, really interesting, because my main research and my main expertise is in digital forensics as well. So it was really good and refreshing. Thank you. Any questions, folks? It seems that no one has a question. So, okay. So, Dr. Bastug, are you going to moderate the next talk, or should I just continue?
I can present, or you can.
No, I will go next. I will go the next. The next. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Loper. So I think I am the next presenter. So I just share my screen. So good morning, everyone. So the topic of this presentation would be on the dark web and policing cyberspace, and a number of challenges that that police face when trying to police the dark web. So the agenda for this talk would be I give a very brief introduction to myself, and then I talk a bit about the structure of cyberspace, and then the dark web, some of the tools and services of the dark web, and then challenges posed to law enforcement agencies. Then some potential solutions, and then discussion, of course, question and answer session. Okay. So about me. I'm a senior lecturer in cyber threats at Swansea University, which is based in the United Kingdom. I am also a member of Cyber Threats Research Center here in Swansea. So in our center, we explore a range of online threats, from terrorism, extremism, and cybercrime to child sexual exploitation online and grooming. So our aims are to better understand online threats and produce new original empirical research and inform policy and practice. Okay. So I'm also a member of Strategic Independent Advisory Group with South Wales Police, as well as being a program steering and committee member for annual international conference on global security, safety, and sustainability. I forgot to change the slide, sorry. Okay. So for those who aren't familiar with the dark web, cyberspace is divided into three parts. We have the surface web, we have the deep web, and we also have the dark web. So to understand the difference between the surface web, the deep web, and the dark web, we usually take the analogy of an iceberg to visualize the cyberspace. So the tip of the iceberg that's visible to all internet users is called the surface web. And this part of the web is completely searchable and indexable. So it's visible to anyone using a search engine like Google, Internet Explorer, or Safari. So only a tiny portion of the internet resides on the surface web, something between 1% to 4%. And then we have the deep web, which is the remaining part of the web, which is about 96% of the web. So its content include anything that requires signing credential, okay? Or anything behind the paywall, or anything that requires signing credentials again. It could include anything, any content that its owners have blocked web crawlers from indexing. So examples could include private servers, intranets, or typical social media pages that have been said to remain hidden from general public, okay? Then we also have the dark web, okay? The dark web is a subset and a small fraction of the deep web, I think 1%. And that's intentionally hidden. It's not visible to search engines. So it requires the use of a specialized anonymizing browser called Tor or Onion router to be accessed. This Tor network, as you might be familiar, was developed back in late 1990s by the US Department of Defense. And this network was both anonymized and encrypted, and was intended, of course, to protect the sensitive communication of US spies. But its original purpose wasn't fully achieved. So instead, some researchers still saw a different value in it. So they launched a nonprofit project that focused on anonymity for human rights and privacy activists, okay? So dark web websites look quite similar to any other website, but there are also important differences. So one would be the naming structure. Instead of ending in .com, .co, or .org, the dark websites end in .onion, okay? And the dark web websites also use a jumbled naming system. This, of course, leads to URLs that are nearly impossible to remember. For example, the URL I've put down on the slide is the URL of a popular commerce called Dream Market. So that's how it generates the URL. So similar to any other technologies, the dark web has a dual use. So despite its horrible sounding name, not everything on it is illegal or sinister. Here I will give some examples of its benign uses by different actors. For example, the dark web is used by privacy conscious individuals concerned by how corporations and governments are tracking, using, and potentially monetizing their data, okay? By people in countries where there is eavesdropping or where internet access is criminalized. By political activists, journalists, and descendants in countries that are governed by authoritarian rulers who often punish individuals with opposing views. So the dark web could protect them from prosecutions and, of course, their anonymity. It also gets used by whistleblowers to leak secrets without the fear of retribution or judgment in their workplace or communities. It gets used by law enforcement agencies, by legitimate web companies to have better insight into their digital assets. So this gives them insight on what hackers are targeting so that they can protect themselves better. Also, nearly every major newspapers operate a hidden website on tour, like the New York Times and even the CIA. And this would be to enable communication with individuals who can provide, of course, sensitive information. Tools or services on the dark web can be categorized into the points I've included on the slides. Again, because of the time limit, I will only discuss in the next slide ransomware as a service, which is an emerging cyber threat. There are also 3 risk variables for each category, okay? One of these relates to devaluing the enterprise, which could include undermining brand trust, reputational damage, or losing ground to a competitor. The second one is disrupting the enterprise, which could include DDoS attacks or other malware that affects business operations. Then we have the third one, which concerns defrauding the enterprise, which could include IP theft or espionage that impairs a company's ability to compete for, or which causes a direct financial loss. Okay. Ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service kits have been available on the dark web for several years, but these services have now become far more dangerous with the rise of specialized criminal groups like Arrival or GANCRAP. Okay, groups as such develop their own sophisticated malware, sometimes combined with pre-existing tools and distribute them through affiliates. Of course, they get a cut from whatever earning those affiliates get, okay? Then the affiliates distribute the ransomware packages through the dark web. These attacks often include stealing victims' data and threatening to release it on the dark web if the ransom isn't paid. So as you can imagine, a crime that has been carried out or facilitated through the combination of a hidden encrypted network with a transactional currency almost makes it impossible for law enforcement agencies to trace the perpetrators. Now, this brings me to law enforcement agencies' response and the challenges they face when investigating the dark web crime. Okay. Criminals on the dark web now are forcing law enforcement agencies in the United States and Europe to change the way they conduct investigations in cyberspace. What this means is that sometimes police have had to resort to practices that are not normal channels to enforce the law when investigating dark web crimes. So this has raised a number of legal and ethical challenges, okay? So how do law enforcement agencies actually respond to dark web crimes? Well, they use a number of methods, some of which some people consider, as I said, questionable. These could include the use of undercover investigation, malware, hacking, or DDoS attacks. Very briefly, some of these methods that they use. So one practice that law enforcement agencies worldwide have commonly used has been the use of undercover investigation. So these investigations have included agents' use of investigation chat rooms or other peer-to-peer networks to pose as offenders or participants in illicit activities. This method of enforcement has presented significant and promising results, and a successful of these include the arrest of Ross Albright back in 2013, and I assume most of you know the case. So Albright was the creator of the Silk Road 2, which according to the police was the most sophisticated and extensive criminal marketplace on the internet at the time. So reportedly, Ross's involvement in the Silk Road was exposed by an undercover agent who located a series of posts on the dark web forums. After the police monitored accounts that were suspected to be linked to the Silk Road, then the agents found a post where Albright provided his Gmail account through which the FBI managed to locate it. So despite being so clever, so intelligent, this was a very fatal and silly mistake that he made, which led to his arrest. So I'm not too sure how else the police would have been able to catch this guy, because he's very talented. There are, however, challenges with undercover investigations on the dark web, even though undercover operations have historically been successful. For example, one of the main issues relates to a large presence of undercover police on the dark web. So this has caused criminals to become increasingly suspicious. So I would say that sooner or later, this awareness amongst criminals will stop undercover investigations becoming a permanent solution to the problem. And because of this, I would say that this method has started falling out of favor, if you know what I mean. Now, this one is very, very contagious, especially in the US after this case was investigated. So law enforcement agencies have also used honeypot traps, i.e. websites that pretend to be linked to illicit activities. So these websites get set up by the police to capture the web user's IP address. An example of this method concerns Playpen, which was a notorious dark web child pornography website. So this website, Playpen, operated from, I think, August 2014 to sometimes in March 2015 through a hidden service on the Tor networks. So after the FBI caught its owner, they did not immediately shut down the website. Instead, they continued to run it for another, I think, 13 days or so as part of an operation called Operation Pacifier. So they said the aim is to lure more perverts. This led to, of course, significant backlash. Why? Because the site included links to more than, I think, 23,000 pornographic images and videos of children. Even worse, there were more than 9,000 files, I think more than 9,000 files that users could download directly from the FBI. So the Justice Department criticized the move by saying that children shown in these images are harmed each time they get viewed. And once those images leave the government's control, agents have no way to prevent them from being copied and recopied to other parts of the internet, which is actually true. That's absolutely legitimate criticism. But the FBI stood by the use of the files, and one of their officials claimed that there were no other ways that they could identify as many players on the dark web. I would say that what FBI is also saying is true, but at what cost are you going to do that? I don't have the answer. So there are people who have questioned the ethics of that, okay? So this operation started after a foreign law enforcement agency informed FBI investigators about the site. Of course, then the FBI obtained a single warrant to use a technique called network investigative techniques, which is a code that allowed it remotely to install malware on nearly 9,000 computers in 120 countries to locate the administrators of the site. Basically, it is a hacking, simple hacking. In the subsequent court case against the playpen, the government didn't want to disclose the source code and refused to explain to the defendants how the FBI used the malware. I think that now about 200 cases are pending against the US government over its ability to hack suspects accused of accessing the site. So apart from its ethical dilemmas, there have also been other criticisms of this method of enforcement. So some view honeypot traps as a form of, I don't know, entrapment and infringement on civil liberties. But law enforcement agencies tend to argue that the existence of traps is good. Why? Because it creates uncertainty in the minds of criminals and reduce the sense of freedom and anonymity. Police around the world have also relied on the use of hacking when policing cyberspace. So given its anonymous feature and the protection that the dark web offers, the existing surveillance methods somehow have become obsolete. So police have started implementing implementing hacking techniques which deploy surveillance software over the internet to access and control criminal devices directly. So there are a number of solutions that can address some of these problems. One is about improving the capabilities of domestic law enforcement agencies. I was planning to go on and into more details about each of these points, but we don't have time. And they've already been gracious to me. I was supposed to talk for 10 minutes. Then we have international collaboration, which I've already highlighted some of the benefits of that. For example, an example include the shutdown of the Silk Road, which I discussed earlier. And then Alphabet and hence some marketplaces were also taken down, I think in 2017, mainly because of the collaboration between different law enforcements. Usually we have Dutch, which are really good with investigation of dark web crime. We have German, we have United States and Canada. So a number of those police forces. And of course, improving the capabilities of domestic law enforcement agencies. So international collaborations, there have been a lot of success when the agencies have decided to collaborate, okay? One of them was about Alpha Bay that was shut down by the United States, Canada, and Thailand. And the guy behind it, Alexander Cases, was before he was, I think, extradited. He was found dead in his cell in Thailand cell. Okay. So need for new regulations. Cryptocurrencies, there should be rules for new rules for regulations, and of course there have already been some initiatives like Financial Action Task Force and a number of guidelines that was proposed by 2018 G20 summit. Okay. So concluding remarks. Authoritarian governments will continue their attempts to prevent access to the dark web and the challenges that the dark web poses to their legitimacy. Okay. Of course, we should be concerned with safeguarding political dissidents and activists, whistleblowers, privacy advocates, but doing so is very important, but it must not, we must ensure that this protection is not at the expense of empowering child abusers, armed traffickers, and drug lords. Okay. So I'm not going to discuss any further. Contact me to discuss it. I will love it. I am very excited about the topic. So I love a big chat about it. Okay. So back to you, Dr. Bastug.
Thank you so much. I will try to keep this short. So if you let me, I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Mehmet Bastug. I am an assistant professor at the University of Scranton. So I teach in the cybercrime and homeland security program. I will focus on cyberterrorism and how to counter cyberterrorism in my presentation. I will first explain how we can define and understand cyberterrorism. Then we'll briefly talk about terrorist activities in cyberspace. And finally, I will discuss how to deal with cyberterrorism. So it has become a cliche to begin a discussion of terrorism with underlining the lack of consensus on the concept. Cyberterrorism as a form of terrorism also suffers from the same drawback, as argued by scholars. There's a large amount of subjectivity in what constitutes cyberterrorism. And the meaning of the concept has changed over time, just like our understanding of traditional terrorism has changed since the late 18th century. Early definitions applied a stricter and narrow criteria when defining cyberterrorism, and argued that an act of cyberterrorism should involve a destructive cyber attack that potentially lead to death or injury. And those definitions exclude the terrorist use of the internet. On the other hand, there are some other definitions with a looser understanding of the term. And in my point of view, terrorist use of the internet can also be considered as an act of cyberterrorism. So today's terrorist organizations and extremist groups display a growing interest in cyberspace. They have exploited the new information and communication environments to their advantage. They use the internet and social media to disseminate radical messages and recruit vulnerable individuals. Online radicalization is indeed a growing threat. So many violent extremist groups have emerged on online platforms, particularly in recent years. They operate websites, online journals, and social media profiles to disseminate their ideology, and also use the internet for fundraising and recruitment. So while the terrorist use of the internet is a growing threat, the likelihood of cyber terrorist attacks by terrorist organization is another emerging area of concern. So some argue that unlike cyberterrorism, unlike traditional terrorist attacks, lacks the drama. So it is not a suitable tactic, a suitable terrorist tactic. But I believe this is a misleading statement. A cyber terrorist attack can be as dangerous as a traditional terrorist attack. So far, we have not experienced such an attack, but this is a potential and a real threat. And public surveys also show that the fear of cyber terrorism among the society exists. In a 2019 survey of American fears by Chapman University, cyberterrorism was among the top 10 fears. It's even more fearful phenomenon than traditional terrorism. So we may blame the media framing of cyberterrorism. I'm currently working on a research project examining the framing of the media. And that project so far revealed that the media could not correctly distinguish cyberterrorism from other cyber attacks and cybercrime. So why terrorism is interesting for terrorist groups? There are some underlying factors here. So first, it offers an advantage of action at a distance to terrorist groups. As a result of enhanced border controls, particularly after 9/11, it's more difficult for terrorists to infiltrate in order to carry out physical attacks. And when we look at the cyber terrorist attacks, they can be launched from anywhere in the world. And second, cyberspace can function as a multiplier, where terrorists can inflict more harm with less resources. And third, it offers a degree of anonymity where attackers can hide their identity. And finally, the internet is an unregulated space where terrorists can exploit the lack of centralized control. So what are some terrorist activities on cyberspace? So as I mentioned, these groups display a growing interest in utilizing cyber attacks for terrorist purposes. Such attacks may involve damaging a computer system or causing disruption. There are some hypothetical scenarios, including attacks that lead to power outages, disruption of banking and financial transaction, hacking of aviation control systems to cause planes to crash, infiltrating computer systems of nuclear power plants to trigger a meltdown, or remotely controlling self-driving cars, and the list goes on. But none of these scenarios came to pass so far. So their interest in cyberterrorism does not necessarily mean that they have the capability to do it, at least for now. Such high-level attacks have not yet materialized, but the threat is real. So developing cyber attack capabilities and initiating destructive cyber attacks take a long time. Discovering vulnerabilities and gaining unauthorized access are time and resource intensive. And terrorist groups, they do not currently have that capacity, but they are now in the preparation phase and learning how to adapt and evolve to this changing environment. So if their activities are not disrupted, they may reach such a capacity sooner or later. So there are some typologies in the literature that explain, cyberterrorism. Ballard et al. Developed a typology which created 4 categories. So information attacks involve altering or destroying digital assets. Infrastructure attacks are cyber attacks with implications in the real world. For instance, the Colonial Pipeline hack was a cyber physical attack in which an attack in cyberspace impact the physical environment. And other than cyber attacks, cyberterrorism has other forms as well. As I mentioned, terrorist use of the internet can be an act of cyberterrorism. They use the internet and new communication technologies for communication, recruitment, fundraising, and propaganda. So in a previous research project, my colleagues and I developed a database of foreign fighters and examined the radicalization process they went through to identify the role of online interactions in that radicalization process. So we found that in the 65% of the cases where the data is available, those extremists were radicalized online through their online interactions. So we created a model to explain the process of online radicalization. So first, there are many radical contents online. Some people encounter such materials accidentally while surfing the internet, and some others intentionally search for such contents or some other relevant content. And not everyone who read or watch extremist messages influenced in the same way. So individual susceptibilities play a huge role here, and there are many factors that increase the vulnerability to radicalization. There could be some psychological or sociological or some political factors. And in the third stage, susceptible users move to terrorist mobilization. So that could be taking action by joining a terrorist organization or proselytizing for these organizations online. And in the final step, radicalized individuals who have been mobilized by terrorist organizations take to social media to share their experiences and propagate terrorist messaging, which creates a feedback loop that make new extremist content available online. So now let's look at the risk of cyber terrorist attacks. So risk is a function of likelihood and impact, where the likelihood is the probability of occurrence of an undesired incident, and the impact here is the negative effect on the victim. So the likelihood in this equation has two components, threats and vulnerabilities. The risk is a function of threats, vulnerabilities, and impact. And the risk can never be reduced to zero, but we can minimize it. So we can look at these three components. Let's start with the threat. So can we eliminate the threat? So there are currently terrorist groups that are determined to cause harm, and probably there will be in the future. So the better choice here is to reduce our vulnerabilities and the negative impacts that can be caused by cyber terrorism. So very briefly, first I will discuss countering cyber attacks, then we can move on to countering terrorist use of the internet. So what can we do to reduce our vulnerabilities? So a vulnerability in cybersecurity refers to any weakness in our cybersecurity posture. So strategies that we can implement to counter cyber attacks are indeed similar to countering other cyber threats. Such strategies can include education and training. So there is a famous saying, humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity, and this is correct. And another method is to apply multiple layers of defense, a layered defense approach. So security risks can occur at a variety of levels, including application, system, network, and transmission levels. Therefore, organizations need to plan and implement security measures that provide multiple layers of defense against these risks. National standards, frameworks, and guidelines are also very important in dealing with cyber terrorism because they incorporate best practices in the field and conformance requirements. So by following these standards, organizations can improve their cybersecurity posture. And as I mentioned, cyber attacks can be carried out from anywhere in the world. Unlike most traditional terrorist attacks, the perpetrator is not necessarily to be in close proximity to victims. So in such a context, we need an international cooperation to investigate cyber terrorism, because most likely the perpetrator will be in a different country. So there should be a kind of a cooperation between law enforcement agencies. We can also take some measures to reduce the negative impacts of such attacks. So we are highly dependent on technology as a society. Can we reduce our dependencies? Not really, because the technology already permeates every aspect of our lives. So the better strategy would be implementing effective incident response capability. So we can minimize losses and continue to operate in the face of a disruption. And we can also reduce the risk of future incidents by implementing a good incident response plans. Disaster recovery capabilities are also critical. A good disaster recovery plan can help organizations recover from a cyber incident as quickly and effectively as possible. And to realize those measures, we need a well-trained cybersecurity workforce. The federal government is supporting research projects in developing cybersecurity workforce, and private sector is also doing its part to address the workforce shortage. Universities, I believe, have an essential role in workforce development, and there are now many programs at universities focusing on cybersecurity. So with a good planning and investment, I believe we can reduce our vulnerabilities and lessen the negative impacts of potential cyber attacks. And finally, there are some efforts also we can take to address terrorist and extremist use of the internet. So there are many extremist contents online. In general, three methods are used to address such contents. Social media platforms use artificial intelligence and other methods to identify user-generated extremist content and then remove them from the platform. Filtering is another method in which certain blacklisted contents like keywords dropped from search results. And another method is hiding. It's about hiding extremist content by manipulating search results. And second, we can raise awareness around the threat of online radicalization. Education plays a significant role here, so we should promote a safer internet by spreading awareness on cyber safety. And third, as our online radicalization models suggest, individual susceptibilities can determine whether a person would take the path towards radicalization into violent extremism. So underlying factors for radicalization should also be addressed to prevent online radicalization. And this is the end of my slide. If you have any question, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Bastug. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee saying, what are the most concerning areas in cyberterrorism in terms of targets?
So when we look at the literature in counterterrorism, we can see that it's like the attacks against critical infrastructure are maybe one of the most significant threats currently facing our societies. As we have experienced in the past, there are some ransomware attacks, targeting critical infrastructure, and they cause devastating effects. So in the future, we should be maybe more careful about protecting critical infrastructure.
Okay. So we also have a question again from the anonymous attendee. My question is for all the panelists. Do you find the initiatives from the governments regarding cybersecurity resiliency sufficient? What additional actions would you like to see?
That's a tough question, right? Cybersecurity encompasses a lot of sectors and a lot of different interactions. It's a very complex system. Our economy
depends on which government we are talking about. So what kind of funding they've allocated to it? Are we going to? Yeah. So I leave it to you, Dr. Loper.
One of the things that has been successful so far is increasing the risk of funding the criminal networks. So not so much for cyberterrorism, but general cybercrime, which is, if you think about it, a development of a state-sponsored actors militia. So they have criminal organizations that are out there developing tools, developing techniques, and cultivating a group of victims. And that can be applied to something a little more formal if needed. That was one of the big worries about the Russia-Ukraine war. We thought we might see some of those militias activate. And if we can defund them by not letting them profit from the crimes, that would be a very positive step, and also one that's very realistic in the complex environment that we're talking about. There are a number of organizations that simply wouldn't be able to comply with a fiat of do not pay, or would potentially receive disproportionate damage. A lot of people just have to pay that. Imagine the first time a hospital network is taken out and people lose care. Right now, a government policy would be directly responsible for the death of its citizens. It's not viable. So the things that seem to work best are reducing the safety of paying the ransom, so increased risk OFAC controls. Are you dealing with a banned entity? That gives pause. Simply making it difficult. Right now, if my company, and we do not do this, I want to be absolutely clear, we do not do this, but if we chose to get into the ransom negotiation and brokerage business, we would have to register as a money handling company. So FFIEC, a government regulator here in the United States, makes it difficult for any organization that wants to transfer Bitcoin on behalf of a client. They have to register it essentially as a financial institution. And that increases the risk and increases the drag and this slows it down. I know we don't want to take on those. We don't pay ransom to begin with, but even if we did, there would be a considerable risk to it. So I think government policies that allow actions in a complex system, but disincentivize them are probably going to be our best bet.
So we have a question for Dr. Loper from Suleiman. What are the issues and challenges in public-private cooperation and collaboration in cybersecurity?
This is a perennial topic. When U.S. law enforcement agencies first entered into cybercrime, they made a lot of heavy-handed actions that convinced private entities they did not want to cooperate with them. The FBI has gone to considerable lengths, both through InfraGard and kind of community policing, if you want to think about it that way, programs for corporations, and just simply showing good faith in some of their investigations. They don't come in and seize business necessary systems simply to gather evidence. They've gotten more subtle, more skilled. They've developed a number of programs that help them get around the need to do something big and heavy-handed. I think the future of public-private cooperation looks very good. I think anytime that we scare businesses and, disincentivize is one thing, that's a very fine line. We could always creep over that and scare them, and that would be a loss for us all. The ISACs are also good. The information sharing groups, separate by industry, they have a government-backed non-disclosure agreement, so you can safely share information about threats in your sector. And a lot of my clients participate in those. I've actually represented one of my clients in the ISAC that they were a member of. So it's, I think, a positive program.
We have another question from our anonymous attendee. For a lay person, what are the most effective and efficient ways to protect themselves from being a victim of cybercrime?
You could go with Gene Spafford's idea is turn off your computer. Don't turn it back on. But realistically, back up your files, right? Think about anything you can't afford to lose. Go out to Best Buy, spend $100 on a hard drive and back up the things that you can't afford to lose. Unfortunately, it requires you to keep doing that. And that's where everybody falls down. The other thing is be very careful about where you enter your information online. For example, I've never had a Facebook page, never wanted it, right? It's a little bit harder to spearfish me because of it. Other things, just be really careful about the emails you open. I tend to delete a lot of things if they look the least bit suspicious to me, especially my home systems. And I also pay for corporate grade security on my home systems. There are now subscriptions you can get through web services that are helpful. Identity protection, I can't get a loan without going through significant procedures right now, but I've not had any problems with identity theft.
Good. So any more questions, folks? Oh, no more questions. Okay. So thank you everyone so much for attending.